The secret a child couldn't tell, but a dog could. There's a reason police officers trust their canine partners with their lives. Dogs sense what humans often overlook. And on a rain-soaked morning in Vermont, it was Kaiser who saw first. He led Officer David Ramirez to an abandoned bus stop, where a small figure huddled against the cold. A little girl, soaked, trembling, clutching her stomach as though holding herself together. David bent low, his jacket slipping from his shoulders to cover her. But she flinched and whispered words that revealed more than she knew. "Don't tell Daddy. He gets mad." From that fragile whisper came a storm. Hospital exams revealing hidden bruises, a backpack concealing industrial canisters, and a trail of negligence leading to a powerful company desperate to keep its secrets buried. Yet amid the darkness, there was light, a German shepherd who refused to leave her side. A bond so pure that even in her silence, she found the courage to trust again. The rain had a way of softening Ashwood Junction, as though the town itself wanted to hide its scars. Roof shingles glistened under the pale street lamps, gutters overflowed with brown water, and the narrow sidewalks were slick with puddles that reflected the flicker of neon signs shutting down after the night. It was just past 5 in the morning, that quiet stretch of hours when the world felt suspended between darkness and day, when the last drinkers had stumbled home and the first workers had yet to rise. Officer David Ramirez eased his patrol SUV through the deserted streets, the wipers cutting a metronome across the windshield. Each pass revealed a town asleep, shuttered storefronts, the single gas station with its pumps glistening like dull chrome, and the old diner whose lights burned low but steady, an all-night refuge that smelled of bacon grease and coffee. The rain came steady, not violent, but relentless, a whispering curtain that soaked through uniforms and crept into bones. Beside him, Kaiser stirred. The German shepherd's black and tan coat glistened in the dim light, damp from an earlier stop, and his ears twitched at every distant sound the storm tried to conceal. A delivery truck downshifting, a loose sign clattering against a post, the faint, irregular hum of a transformer. Kaiser pressed his nose against the glass, fogging a patch of window with warm breaths, his body taut with energy even as the town slept. David glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Easy, boy. It's just the rain talking." His voice was low, meant more for himself than for the dog. Kaiser gave a soft whine, but settled, eyes still trained on the passing blur of shadows. The rhythm of the patrol was familiar, and David found comfort in it. The repetition, the slow roll of tires on wet asphalt, the steady pulse of the wipers, it all gave his mind room to wander, though he often wished it wouldn't. He carried the military past in his bones, like old shrapnel that couldn't be removed. Nights in Afghanistan, the dull thump of mortars beyond the wire, the faces of men who never came home. And then the sharper memories, closer to home. His younger brother, Daniel, gone at 32, claimed not by war, but by an addiction that had eaten him alive. David could still see the hollow look in his brother's eyes the last time they'd spoken, and the weight of that silence pressed heavier than the storm outside. These early shifts gave him solitude. No radio chatter, no small talk with fellow officers. Just him, Kaiser, and the steady rain. Out here, he didn't have to pretend he was fine. Out here, he could breathe without feeling the judgment of a world that always wanted answers he couldn't give. They turned onto Willow Creek Road, the SUV's headlights sweeping across the 2-lane stretch, bordered by pine woods that seemed darker than the sky itself. The creek ran swollen and brown beside the road, gurgling like a restless sleeper. David slowed, scanning the empty sidewalks and storefronts that lined this older part of town. Ashwood Junction wasn't large. 2,000 residents on paper. Half that, if you counted only the ones who hadn't given up and moved away. But it had its secrets, and the night shifts had taught him that darkness often kept company with desperation. Kaiser shifted suddenly, muscles tightening. His ears pricked forward, nose lifting toward the crack of a side street that cut toward the bus depot. David's eyes followed. Nothing but shadows and the endless shimmer of rainfall. Still, he trusted the dog more than his own instincts. Kaiser didn't react without reason. "Something got you spooked," David muttered, slowing the cruiser. He felt the familiar prickle run along his spine, the alertness that had never left him since combat. The rain tapped harder on the roof, each drop like a finger drumming out a warning. For a moment, he let the SUV idle at the curb. He studied the dim streetlights, the hunched silhouettes of mailboxes, the silent row of houses with curtains drawn tight. The only movement came from the rain itself, turning the world liquid and indistinct. But Kaiser wouldn't settle. He let out a single sharp bark, sudden and decisive, then pawed at the door. His body leaned forward, as if every nerve in him strained towards something just out of sight. David exhaled slowly, hand brushing the holster at his hip. "All right, partner. Let's take a look." He killed the engine, the headlights fading until the street returned to the muted glow of a few tired lamps. The rain was louder now, drumming against the hood, tapping on the roof in ceaseless rhythm. For a heartbeat, David closed his eyes and let the storm wash over him. The town was asleep, but something out there was awake, waiting. He reached for his raincoat, but didn't bother putting it on. No point. The moment he stepped outside, the storm would claim him anyway. Kaiser leapt out the instant the door opened, paws splashing into shallow puddles, nose low, tail rigid. David followed, boots crunching on wet gravel, the chill of the storm soaking into his collar. The streets of Ashwood Junction held their breath as the officer and his dog moved into the rain. Kaiser's nose pressed to the ground, tracing an invisible thread through the rain-slick street. His movements grew sharper, more insistent, every stride pulling David farther from the cruiser. The leash trembled in his grip, taut with the dog's urgency. "Easy," David whispered, though his own heartbeat had quickened. Years of working with Kaiser had taught him to trust the dog's instincts. He didn't push without reason. The street opened onto a forgotten corner of Ashwood Junction, the old bus stop at Elm and Willow. The shelter sagged under years of neglect, its plexiglass panels streaked with grime and graffiti. A bent metal bench sat beneath a half-collapsed roof, the paint peeling away in flakes that littered the concrete like rusted snow. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement, swaying in the storm. No bus had stopped here in months. The town had rerouted most lines to save costs. Kaiser stopped abruptly at the edge of the shelter, his body stiffened, ears forward, tail rigid. A low whine slipped from his throat as he nosed toward the bench. David followed, his boots splashing into a shallow puddle. At first, the dim light made it look like a heap of discarded clothing left to soak in the storm. But then it moved. A small figure, curled in on itself, knees tucked tight to chest, arms clutched around a narrow stomach. It was a child. David's breath caught. He lowered himself instinctively, the weight of the scene sinking into him. She couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7. Black hair hung wet and tangled across her pale face, strands plastered to her cheeks. A sweatshirt, 2 sizes too big, clung to her small frame, soaked through, sleeves dripping rain onto sneakers caked in mud. One lace dangled loose, the frayed end soaking in a puddle. He crouched at a distance, voice softened against the rhythm of rain. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, careful, low, like speaking to a startled animal. "My name's Officer Ramirez. You're safe. Are you hurt?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice. Her shoulders drew tighter, and for a moment she didn't answer. Then came a whisper, fragile as a breath lost in the storm. "It hurts. It hurts so much. Don't take me home. Daddy will be mad." The words hit David like a fist to the chest. He felt the weight of them settle heavy in his bones, because he knew that kind of fear. He had carried it once himself, in a house where footsteps in the hall meant thunder was coming. Kaiser lay down beside the bench without being told, his body low and still, amber eyes fixed on the girl. Slowly, almost uncertainly, her hand reached out. Tiny fingers brushed against the shepherd's paw, clinging as though the dog were the only solid thing left in a world that spun too fast. Kaiser didn't move, only flicked his tail once against the wet ground, silent reassurance in the storm. David's throat tightened. He shrugged off his patrol jacket, heavy with rain, and draped it gently over her shoulders. "You're freezing," he murmured. "We need to get you warm. Can you tell me your name?" The girl shook her head violently, curls of wet hair whipping across her cheeks. "No," she whispered, eyes wide with panic. "He said not to." David steadied his breath, fighting the urge to press. He knew too well what panic could do to a child. "Okay, that's all right. You don't have to tell me anything right now, but listen." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a promise. "No one's going to hurt you tonight. Not while I'm here, not while Kaiser's here." At the sound of his name, Kaiser shifted, lowering his head until his chin rested lightly on the girl's sneakers. The gesture drew a faint shudder from her, half sob, half sigh, as though something in her small frame finally loosened. She tried to stand, but faltered, her body tensing as if bracing for pain. David caught her gently, careful not to startle. She was far too light, bones pressing sharp beneath drenched fabric. Lifting her felt like carrying both a child and a burden older than she should have ever known. The rain came harder, plastering his hair to his forehead. He looked down at her again, her small hand still gripping Kaiser's fur, even as he held her in his arms. "We're going to the hospital, okay?" he said softly. "They'll help with the hurting, and I'll stay with you." Her lips moved, faint, almost swallowed by the storm. David leaned closer. "What did you say?" "My name's Sophie," she whispered, and then pressed her face into Kaiser's fur, as though speaking the word out loud had cost her everything she had left. David swallowed hard, nodding once though she couldn't see. "That's a beautiful name, Sophie. And you did the right thing tonight." As he carried her back toward the cruiser, Kaiser trotting close at his side, David felt that hollow chill rise again in his chest. This wasn't just a lost child in the rain. The storm had uncovered something deeper, darker, a truth that wouldn't stay hidden for long. And Sophie, trembling in his arms, was only the beginning. The patrol SUV idled at the curb, its headlights spilling across the rain like pale spears. David adjusted Sophie carefully in his arms, his jacket wrapped around her thin frame. The fabric dwarfed her, swallowing her body like a borrowed shadow, but at least it trapped a little warmth. She clung to it weakly, her small fingers clutching the sleeve as though afraid he might take it back. Kaiser trotted close, his paws splashing through shallow puddles, never more than a step away. When David opened the rear door, the shepherd leapt inside first, settling instantly onto the seat as though he knew his role. His body stretched across the vinyl like a living wall, his amber eyes soft but alert. Only when Kaiser was in place did David lower Sophie gently beside him. She didn't resist. Instead, she leaned into the dog almost immediately, tucking her face into his damp fur. The tremors in her small body eased slightly, her hand gripping Kaiser's collar, as if anchoring herself against an unseen tide. David lingered a moment, crouched at the door, watching her. The rain pattered off the roof, dripping in rivulets down his neck, but he barely noticed. The girl's silence pressed heavier than the storm. Children should whimper, complain, ask questions. Sophie did none of those things. Her stillness was too old for her age. Finally, he shut the door gently, circled to the driver's side, and slid into his seat. The cabin smelled of wet dog and rain-damp fabric, but underneath was something sharper, fear, like the lingering scent of smoke after a fire. David started the engine, the headlights carving a path through the mist. As the SUV pulled onto Willow Creek Road, Sophie stirred. She shifted closer to Kaiser, her knees drawn up beneath the oversized jacket, her head resting against the dog's broad shoulder. Kaiser didn't move except for the faint sweep of his tail against the seat, a steady rhythm of reassurance. David lowered the police radio volume until it was little more than a hum. He didn't want chatter filling the air, didn't want Sophie to feel like she was another case number logged into a system. Tonight, she was just a child, alone in a storm. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Her eyes were open now, wide and dark, reflecting the faint glow of dashboard lights. They followed the movement of passing street lamps, as though expecting each one to reveal some hidden threat. Every time another car splashed by, her body stiffened. "You're safe," David said softly, his eyes flicking back to the road. "We're just going to the hospital. They'll make sure your stomach feels better. That's all." No response. Just the sound of rain hammering the windshield and the faint whimper Kaiser made as he shifted closer to her. David tried again. "Sophie, right? That's what you told me?" Her voice was barely audible. "Yes." It was the first word she'd spoken since leaving the bus stop, and it landed heavy in the quiet car. David nodded, keeping his tone calm. "That's a strong name. You did good telling me. That helps me take care of you." She turned her face back into Kaiser's fur as though hiding from even that gentle praise. The shepherd didn't flinch. He simply adjusted, pressing closer, allowing her to disappear against him. David's hands tightened on the wheel. He recognized the signs, silence like armor, eyes scanning doors and windows, a body flinching at every sudden sound. It wasn't just hunger or cold. This was fear carved deep, a fear that didn't come from scraped knees or schoolyard bullies. His jaw clenched as memories stirred. He remembered his own childhood bedroom, the paint peeling on the ceiling, the smell of cheap whiskey seeping under the door. He remembered the way his younger brother would crawl into his bed at night, whispering, "Don't let him yell at me again." The helplessness that lived in those years never left. He felt it now, echoing through Sophie's silence. He forced his voice gentle, steady. "You don't have to tell me anything tonight. Not if you don't want to. But I promise, no one's going to hurt you while you're with me, or with Kaiser." At the mention of the dog, Sophie peeked out again. Her small hand stroked Kaiser's fur, slow and tentative, until her fingers curled into it. She whispered something so faint, David almost missed it. "Will he stay?" David glanced in the mirror, met her wide eyes. "Yes, he's your guard tonight. He doesn't leave." That answer seemed to ease something in her. She closed her eyes, leaning more fully into Kaiser, who let out a quiet huff, content. The SUV rolled through the quiet town, the rain drumming steady. Storefronts blurred past, their neon signs still glowing dim, casting streaks of color across the wet asphalt. David's thoughts churned. Sophie's plea at the bus stop, "Don't take me home," had not been the plea of a child afraid of punishment for sneaking out. It had been desperate, rooted in something darker. He tightened his grip on the wheel. He had seen enough in his years of service to know the difference between mischief and abuse. The bruises he glimpsed under her sleeve, the gauntness in her cheeks, the way her body recoiled when asked her name. All of it told a story no 6-year-old should have to live. The hospital's lights finally appeared through the rain, glowing like a beacon against the dark. David exhaled, tension loosening just slightly. He glanced back one last time. Sophie was awake but quiet, her face pale against Kaiser's fur. Her eyes flicked to the window as they pulled under the emergency canopy, fear sparking again in their depths. David killed the engine, turned gently in his seat. "We're here. Just a few steps inside, and someone will help with the hurting. Kaiser's coming too. You'll see." Her small nod was barely there, but it was something. David stepped out, rain soaking him instantly, then opened the rear door. Kaiser moved first, slipping down to the pavement, shaking droplets from his coat. David reached in and lifted Sophie again, her weight feather-light. She didn't fight, only clung to the jacket and kept one fist tangled in Kaiser's collar as though terrified to let go. Together, the three of them moved through the storm toward the hospital's glowing doors. An officer, scarred by memory, a child carrying secrets too heavy for her small frame, and a shepherd who bore them both in silence. David knew this was only the beginning. The automatic doors hissed open, spilling a wash of fluorescent light into the rain-soaked night. David stepped through first, Sophie cradled against his chest, Kaiser padding silently at his side. The warmth of the hospital hit them like a wave, disinfectant sharp in the air, the sterile hum of machines and overhead lights buzzing faintly. It was jarring after the hush of the storm, but Sophie barely stirred. She burrowed deeper into David's jacket, her small hand still clenched in Kaiser's fur. The triage nurse at the reception desk looked up, her expression shifting instantly from routine professionalism to alarm. She rose quickly, her chair scraping the linoleum. "What happened?" she asked, stepping around the desk. "Found her at a bus stop," David said, his voice tight but controlled. 6 years old, maybe 7, abdominal pain, bruises. She begged not to go home. The words tasted bitter. Saying them out loud made them heavier, more real. The nurse nodded briskly, already in motion. "Room 3. I'll page Dr. Patel." David carried Sophie down the corridor, Kaiser's nails clicking softly on the tile floor. The walls glowed that clinical pale green, lined with faded posters, reminding patients to wash their hands, to cover their coughs, to get flu shots. Sophie's eyes darted toward them, wide and unsettled, but she didn't speak. Inside room 3, the nurse pulled on gloves, her hands practiced and efficient. "Set her here," she instructed. David lowered Sophie gently onto the hospital bed. The paper sheet crinkled under her small body, and she flinched at the sound. Immediately, Kaiser jumped up, not onto the bed, but to the side, planting himself so close his fur brushed her arm. Sophie reached for him instinctively, fingers tangling in his collar again. The nurse frowned. "Sir, the dog, he stays," David said firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate. "She panics without him." The nurse hesitated, but one look at the child's death grip on the shepherd settled the argument. She nodded once and turned back to her work. Sophie lay stiff under David's jacket, knees pulled to her chest, face pale against the pillow. The nurse checked her pulse, her breathing, her temperature. Each touch made Sophie flinch as though expecting pain. "She's cold," the nurse murmured, "and dehydrated. Get doctor." "Patel in here now." Minutes later, the door opened, and a petite woman in navy scrubs stepped inside. Her hair was tied neatly back, her movements calm, controlled. Dr. Nita Patel had the kind of presence that steadied a room without words. She glanced first at David, then at the child curled on the bed, then at Kaiser, who watched her every move with unblinking focus. "Officer Ramirez," she said softly, recognizing him from past calls. "Tell me what we know." David gave a clipped summary. Where he'd found Sophie, what she'd whispered, the bruises he'd glimpsed beneath her clothes. Dr. Patel listened, her eyes never leaving Sophie. When David finished, she approached slowly, kneeling beside the bed, so she was level with the child. "Hi, sweetheart. My name is Dr. Patel. I'm just going to check how your tummy feels, okay?" Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came. She pressed closer to Kaiser, who lowered his head until it rested on the edge of the mattress. His steady presence seemed to hold her in place. Dr. Patel glanced at David, then back to Sophie. "He can stay right here with you. You don't have to let go." That earned the faintest nod from Sophie, and for the first time since she'd been found, her shoulders eased a fraction. Dr. Patel pulled on fresh gloves and began a gentle examination, her hands moving with the care of someone accustomed to fragile bodies and fragile trust. She lifted the hem of Sophie's sweatshirt just enough to press lightly against her abdomen. The girl whimpered, her small hands tightening on Kaiser's fur. I know, Dr. Patel murmured. "It won't take long." David stood at the foot of the bed, fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to look away, but forced himself not to. Sophie needed someone to bear witness. What lay beneath the sweatshirt made his stomach twist. Purple bruises bloomed across her ribs, some fading yellow at the edges, others fresh and angry. The skin on her side was mottled, irritated with a faint rash that looked more chemical than bacterial. Beneath her ribs, swelling suggested deeper injury. Dr. Patel's brow furrowed. She traced one bruise lightly with her gloved finger. "These aren't from a fall," she said quietly. "And the rash? This doesn't match infection. We'll need blood work, maybe an ultrasound." She looked up at David. "But she's been exposed to something. This is long-term, not just a single accident." David's jaw tightened. He could feel Sophie's eyes on him, wide and afraid. He forced his expression to soften, though inside a storm raged. "Is it bad?" he asked. "We won't know the extent until we run tests," Dr. Patel answered. "But she's hurting, and she's been hurting for a while." Sophie whimpered again, her voice breaking into the room like glass. "It's just the bug," she whispered. "Daddy said, just a bug. Stop whining." The words froze David in place. They weren't her words. They were rehearsed, repeated, learned through fear. He swallowed hard, then crouched closer to the bed. "Sophie," he said gently, "it's not your fault you feel this way. You're not whining. You're brave." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer. She pressed her face into Kaiser's fur instead, muffling a sob. The shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply absorbed her fear as if it belonged to him. "Doctor." Patel rose quietly, pulling off her gloves. "We'll stabilize her. Get fluids started, run tox screens, scan for internal damage. But, Officer Ramirez..." She paused, her eyes grave. "This child has been living in danger for longer than tonight." David nodded slowly, though his throat felt tight. "I know." The rain outside still streaked the windows, but in here, the storm had a new face. Bruises, whispers, and a child who clung to a dog because he was the only safe thing she knew. And for David, that was enough to know this was only the beginning. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above the exam room, casting a sterile glow over walls that smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain-damp clothes. Sophie lay curled on the bed, David's heavy jacket still draped over her small frame, her knees drawn to her chest. Kaiser stood beside her, chin resting on the mattress, amber eyes locked on the girl, as if every flicker of her breath mattered. Dr. Patel moved carefully, her voice steady, every gesture deliberate. "Sophie, sweetheart," she murmured, "I'm just going to lift your sweatshirt a little higher, so I can check your tummy. It may be a little uncomfortable, but I'll be gentle." Sophie didn't respond. Her hand stayed tangled in Kaiser's collar, knuckles pale with the effort of holding on. David shifted closer, crouching so he was eye level with her. He softened his voice the way he would with a child lost in a crowd. "He's right here. Kaiser won't move an inch. I'll be right here too. You don't have to be afraid." Slowly, Sophie loosened her grip on the jacket. Dr. Patel pulled the fabric upward, exposing the fragile curve of her ribs and abdomen. What lay beneath made the room fall into silence. The skin was mottled with purplish bruises that overlapped like storm clouds. Some had faded into sickly yellow and green, evidence of older injuries. Others were fresh, angry purple, the edges sharp and defined. Along her ribs, faint linear marks hinted at repeated impact. And across the lower abdomen bloomed a rash, irregular, inflamed patches that spread like a map of pain, raw in a way that suggested not bacteria, but exposure to something harsh, chemical. Dr. Patel inhaled quietly, a sound caught between shock and fury. She glanced up at David, her eyes grim. "These aren't playground bruises," she said under her breath. "And the rash. This doesn't look like infection. It's consistent with chemical contact." David's stomach tightened. He forced himself to keep his eyes steady, to not let the anger boiling inside him spill out where Sophie could see it. She needed calm, not rage. Dr. Patel pressed gently along the bruised area, gauging for tenderness. Sophie flinched and whimpered, her small voice breaking the stillness. "It's just the bug," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Daddy said, just a bug. Stop whining." The words cut through David like broken glass. Not just the pain in her voice, but the rehearsed cadence, the echo of someone else's anger shaping her truth. It wasn't her voice. It was his, drilled into her until she believed it. David leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "Sophie, listen to me. That's not a bug. That's not your fault. You're not whining. You're brave for telling us it hurts." Her lips trembled, but she didn't meet his eyes. She turned her face back into Kaiser's fur, muffling her tears in the shepherd's thick coat. Kaiser shifted slightly, pressing his head firmer against her side, as if to shoulder part of her pain. Dr. Patel continued, her tone gentle, but her words sharp with medical precision. "There's swelling here, just under the ribs," she said to David. "It could indicate internal irritation, maybe even early damage to the liver. We'll need an ultrasound to be sure." David nodded, though his jaw was clenched tight. "How bad are we talking?" "If we hadn't caught it now..." Dr. Patel paused, choosing her words carefully. "Prolonged exposure could have been life-threatening. Children's bodies can't process toxins like this. It doesn't take much to cause real harm." The weight of it sank heavy in the room. David looked at Sophie again, at the way she curled into herself, trying to disappear, clutching at the one constant she trusted, Kaiser. He felt a familiar helplessness gnawing at him, the same helplessness that had haunted his own childhood home, when raised voices meant fear. He clenched his fists until his knuckles ached, forcing the memories back. This wasn't about him. This was about her. Dr. Patel lowered Sophie's sweatshirt gently, covering her back up. "We'll start fluids and run tox screens," she said softly. "We'll know more soon. But I need you to understand. This didn't happen overnight. This child has been living with this for some time." David exhaled slowly, nodding once. "I understand." Sophie whimpered again, her voice muffled in Kaiser's fur. "I wasn't supposed to say. He gets mad when I cry." David felt something inside him crack. He forced his tone even, but his words carried a quiet fire. "You don't have to keep secrets anymore, Sophie. Not here. Not with us." Kaiser gave a low, steady chuff, as if adding his own vow. Sophie's hand tightened around his collar, but for the first time, her grip wasn't just desperate, it was seeking comfort. Dr. Patel placed a hand gently on David's arm, her eyes serious. "Officer Ramirez, this isn't just medical. This is neglect, abuse, and likely ongoing exposure to hazardous chemicals. If what she's saying is true, someone has been gaslighting her to believe her pain is imaginary. That's dangerous. Not just physically, but psychologically." David nodded, his throat thick. He didn't trust his voice just then, so he let the silence hold. He looked again at Sophie, pale under the harsh lights, her body small and broken in ways no 6-year-old should ever endure. The storm outside continued its relentless drumming against the windows. But inside the room, another storm was gathering, one built from truth, anger, and the fragile hope that tonight might be the start of something better. David glanced at Kaiser, then back at Sophie. She had said it was just a bug. He knew better, and he silently promised her, as the rain streaked down the glass, that whoever made her believe that lie would answer for it. The exam room had quieted after Dr. Patel's warning. But the silence wasn't peace. It was heavy, like a storm lingering just beyond the walls. Sophie lay curled beneath the thin hospital blanket, her small frame dwarfed by the bed. Kaiser remained pressed close, his chin on the mattress, eyes fixed on her as if daring the world to come closer. David stood near the doorway, arms crossed, his uniform still damp with rain. He felt every beat of his pulse in his temples. He wanted answers, and answers, he knew, often hid in plain sight. At the foot of the bed sat Sophie's backpack, a faded pink canvas thing, one strap broken and tied back together with a piece of wire. It looked like something rescued from a thrift store bin, scuffed and stained, with a few cheap keychains dangling from the zipper. At first glance, it seemed harmless. Just another child's possession. But David had learned long ago that appearances were liars. He crouched, careful not to make sudden movements that might spook Sophie. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "I'm going to take a look in your bag, just to see if there's anything in here that can help the doctors understand why your tummy hurts. Is that okay?" No answer. Sophie's eyes peeked out from beneath the blanket, wide and wary. Her small hand tightened on Kaiser's collar. Kaiser flicked his ears and gave a low, reassuring huff, as though speaking for her. David nodded once, reading the silence as reluctant permission. He tugged the zipper slowly. The teeth parted with a rasp that sounded louder than it should have in the sterile room. Inside lay the scattered belongings of a child who had carried her world on her back. A towel rolled into a ball, stiff with dirt, a broken plastic toy car, one wheel missing, a crumpled paper drawing of a dog that looked suspiciously like Kaiser, though done with the shaky lines of a child's hand. But beneath those innocent things was something that didn't belong. David's eyes narrowed as he shifted the towel aside. Nestled in the bottom of the bag were 4 small metal canisters, each no larger than a soda can. Their caps were rusted, their labels worn, but the faint black triangles stamped on the sides were unmistakable. Warning symbols. Hazardous materials. Even through the hospital air, David caught the bitter chemical tang that clung to the metal. His stomach dropped. He reached for one with gloved hands from a nearby tray. The surface was cold, slick with condensation. The faded letters stenciled on the side were just barely legible. Solvent-based coating, industrial use only. Kaiser growled. The sound was low, guttural, vibrating in his chest. His ears pinned back, his gaze locked on the canister as though it were alive. It wasn't the reaction of a dog spooked by an object. It was recognition. David froze, the weight of memory hitting him. A year ago, at the edge of town, there had been a fire at an East Line freight warehouse. Official reports had called it accidental, faulty wiring, nothing suspicious. But Kaiser had lingered in the rubble for hours, circling barrels and paint drums that bore similar labels. His instincts had screamed that something was wrong. The case had fizzled out, paperwork buried beneath routine. David had never stopped wondering if they'd missed something, and now here it was, in the backpack of a 6-year-old girl. He set the canister carefully on the counter. His voice was steady, but a cold fire burned beneath it. "She's been carrying these." Dr. Patel stepped closer, her brow furrowing. "Good God." She leaned in, studying the faded warnings. "That smell. It's strong. These solvents aren't meant to be anywhere near children, let alone carried around in a bag like toys." David's jaw clenched. He looked back at Sophie, who was watching them from under the blanket, her face pale, eyes wide with something more than fear. It was guilt, as though she believed she had done something wrong by bringing those canisters here. "Sweetheart," he said softly, crouching so he was level with her again. "Did your daddy give you these?" Sophie buried her face in Kaiser's fur, shaking her head so hard her wet hair slapped against the blanket. "It's our secret," she whispered, barely audible. "He said, 'Don't tell.' He gets mad." The words twisted like a knife. Gaslighting. Manipulation. A child convinced her own pain was just a bug, convinced that carrying poison was a secret game. David's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "You're not in trouble, Sophie. Not for this. This isn't your fault. Do you understand?" She didn't answer, but her small hand crept further into Kaiser's fur, fingers curling tight. The shepherd's tail flicked once against the mattress, a silent vow. Dr. Patel straightened, removing her gloves with a snap. "We'll have these tested immediately. If she's been exposed repeatedly, that explains the bruising, the rash, the abdominal swelling. This isn't just neglect. This is dangerous." David rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the canisters. He remembered the fire, the lingering suspicion, the way the case had gone cold without answers. And now he had the link, a direct thread from that abandoned warehouse to a child who had begged not to be taken home. Kaiser let out another low growl, breaking the silence. David reached down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "I know, boy," he murmured. "I smell it too." The storm outside beat harder against the hospital windows, as if echoing the unease in the room. David felt the old soldier's instinct rising in him, the sense that a battle was coming, one hidden beneath layers of lies and silence. He looked again at Sophie. She had finally stopped shaking, her small body pressed against Kaiser, her breathing slow but shallow. She was still holding the secret, still carrying more than any child should. But David knew now that the secret had a name, and it smelled like solvents, smoke, and betrayal. The storm had quieted by the time Marilyn Carter stepped into Cedar Glen Community Hospital, but the world outside still carried its weight. The glass doors slid shut behind her, muting the steady drizzle and the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement. Inside, fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the waiting area, where a vending machine hummed and a stack of outdated magazines curled at the edges. Marilyn adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, the familiar weight of files and case notes pulling against her shoulder. She moved with the kind of quiet determination that came from years of walking into rooms where children's lives hung in the balance. Her brown hair, streaked with early gray, was pulled into a neat bun. The lines around her eyes were not from age alone, but from years of listening, of bending down to meet frightened gazes, of offering comfort when the world had failed to. She was known across the county as firm but compassionate. She never sugarcoated the truth, but she also never forgot what it was to be the child on the other side of the clipboard. She had grown up in foster care herself, shuffled through 3 homes before finally landing with a retired teacher who taught her that gentleness could coexist with strength. That memory of being seen, finally seen, followed her into every case. At the nurse's station, she flashed her badge. Marilyn Carter, Department of Social Services. I'm here for the Ramirez case. 6-year-old female, brought in this morning. Nurse Lena nodded quickly. Room 12. She's stable, but... She hesitated, lowering her voice. It's bad, and she's terrified. Won't speak much. Marilyn's lips pressed into a line. Thank you. She walked the hallway with a steady step, the soles of her low-heeled shoes whispering against linoleum. As she neared the door, she caught a glimpse through the small window. A child curled on the bed, a blanket tucked to her chin, and a German shepherd stretched out at her side like a sentinel. David Ramirez stood nearby, broad shoulders stiff under his uniform, his gaze fixed on the floor, as though the weight of the morning pressed down on him. Marilyn pushed the door open gently, not wanting to startle the child. The shepherd's head lifted instantly, amber eyes sharp. His ears pricked, a low rumble deep in his chest until David murmured, "It's okay, Kaiser. She's here to help." The dog's gaze lingered on Marilyn, measuring, before settling back at the child's side. Marilyn set her satchel down on the counter and moved slowly toward the bed. She didn't speak right away. She knew better than to flood silence with words. Sometimes, silence was all a child had left. Sophie's eyes peeked over the edge of the blanket, wide and watchful. Her small fingers knotted in Kaiser's fur. Marilyn crouched down, resting her hands loosely on her knees so she was eye level. Her voice was soft, threaded with calm. "Hi, sweetheart. My name is Marilyn. I work with kids who need a little extra help. May I sit here for a while?" Sophie didn't answer. Her gaze darted to David, then back to Kaiser. The shepherd shifted, placing one heavy paw over her arm as if to reassure her. Marilyn smiled faintly. "That's a good friend you've got there. He looks like he knows how to keep secrets." Something flickered in Sophie's eyes. Doubt, maybe, or longing. She buried her face against Kaiser's neck, but she didn't turn away. Marilyn let the quiet stretch. She remembered being that child, desperate for someone to listen but too afraid to trust. After a long moment, she said softly, "You don't have to tell me anything today if you don't want to. That's okay. I just want you to know. You're safe here. Nobody is going to be mad at you. Not me. Not Officer Ramirez. Not your doctor. And definitely not Kaiser." The child's breath hitched. Her hand moved slightly, fingers tracing the shepherd's collar. Her whisper was almost lost in the hum of the monitors. "Daddy gets mad." Marilyn's chest tightened, but her expression didn't change. She nodded slowly, as though Sophie had just told her the most important truth in the world. "I believe you, and I promise you, no one here is going to let that happen again. David shifted behind them, his jaw tight. He looked as if he wanted to speak, but Marilyn gave him a subtle shake of her head. Patience, trust was a fragile thing. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small notebook. Not the official one with case numbers and reports. This one was worn, the cover soft from years of use. She flipped it open and showed Sophie a page filled with doodles of flowers, stars, and the outline of a dog. "When I meet new friends," she said, "sometimes I let them draw something here. A picture, even just a scribble. It's their page, nobody else's. Would you like that?" For a long moment, Sophie didn't move. Then, slowly, her small hand emerged from beneath the blanket. She reached for the crayon Marilyn had set gently on the sheet. Her strokes were hesitant at first, shaky. A circle, a pair of triangles, 2 dots for eyes. It was a dog, clumsy, uneven, but unmistakably Kaiser. When she was finished, she pushed the notebook back toward Marilyn and hid her face again. Marilyn smiled, her heart aching in that way it always did when a child handed her a fragment of themselves. She closed the notebook carefully. "That's beautiful, Sophie. Thank you for trusting me with it." At the sound of her name, Sophie peeked out again. The barest spark of recognition lingered in her eyes. She hadn't said the word aloud, but she hadn't denied it either. Kaiser exhaled, a deep, steady sigh, as if even he knew that a door had opened, however slightly. Marilyn straightened slowly, giving the child her space. She glanced at David, her voice low. "She'll need time. But we've got the start of something, and that's enough for today." David nodded, relief flickering across his tired features. Marilyn turned back once more before leaving, her gaze gentle. "I'll come back tomorrow, Sophie. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. I'll just sit with you. And Kaiser too, if he doesn't mind." The shepherd's tail tapped once against the bed, an unspoken agreement. Marilyn left the room quietly, her satchel heavier now with the weight of a single crayon drawing. In her world, small victories mattered. And today, a frightened little girl had reached out from behind her silence. That was the beginning. The room was quiet again after Marilyn left, though not empty. Quiet could sometimes be heavier than noise. The steady beep of the monitor kept time, like a heart too weary to sing. Rain tapped faintly against the hospital window, the storm softening into drizzle, but inside the walls the weight of the morning still pressed down. David sat in the plastic chair by the bed, hands folded, elbows on his knees. His eyes moved between Sophie and Kaiser, who remained sprawled across the thin mattress, his head resting on the child's small lap. The shepherd barely moved, only his amber eyes shifting whenever Sophie stirred. David had seen hardened soldiers fall apart under less strain than this little girl carried. It twisted something deep inside him. Sophie's fingers clutched the dog's collar now, knuckles white, as though letting go might mean being swept away. She hadn't spoken since Marilyn's visit, but David could tell something was brewing under her silence. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Sophie, I know this is hard. Nobody's going to make you talk before you're ready. But if there's something you want to tell us, anything at all, I promise, I'll listen." The girl's gaze stayed fixed on Kaiser, her lips trembling. For a moment, David thought she might retreat again, bury herself back into the blankets. But then came the smallest whisper, like wind slipping through a crack in the door. "I can't talk about the cans." David's chest tightened. He kept his face calm, careful not to let the surge of anger or sorrow show. He knew children could sense those things, even when adults thought they'd hidden them. He nodded slowly. "That's okay. You don't have to. Not right now. You're safe here. Kaiser and we'll make sure of it." But Sophie shook her head quickly, her hair clinging in damp strands to her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she repeated, a little louder this time. "I can't. Daddy said." Her small body curled tighter against the shepherd, almost disappearing into his thick coat. Kaiser, steady as a mountain, didn't flinch. He only shifted slightly so that his collar pressed firmer into her grip, as though telling her he could bear the weight she couldn't. David swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her the truth, that she wasn't wrong, that she had every reason to be afraid, that the bruises on her body and the solvents in her bag screamed a story louder than words. But to push too fast would be to shatter what little trust she had begun to form. He glanced at Kaiser. The shepherd's tail moved once, a faint thump against the blanket, like a heartbeat. Sophie responded to it immediately. She leaned her cheek against his neck and began to speak, not to David, not to the doctor, but to the dog. Her words came in fragments, fragile, meant only for the soft fur that soaked them up. He said, "Secret project. I'm not supposed to tell. If I tell, he'll be mad." David sat back, letting the moment belong to her and the dog. His throat burned. Kaiser's ears twitched, his amber eyes steady on David as if to say, "I've got her for now." Sophie's voice faltered into silence again. She twisted the collar between her small fingers, her shoulders shaking. But no tears came. Children who had been scolded too long for crying often learned to swallow their tears, David knew. That was its own kind of wound. Finally, she whispered something so faint, David had to strain to hear it. "I don't want him to be mad anymore." That was it. The heart of it. Not the bruises, not the chemicals, not even the hospital bed. It was fear. A child's world, reduced to tiptoeing around an anger too big for her to carry. David leaned forward, his voice breaking the silence gently. "Sophie, listen to me. Whatever your dad told you, it doesn't matter right now. You are not in trouble. Not for the cans, not for telling us, not for anything. And no matter what happens, Kaiser and we won't let anyone hurt you again." Sophie didn't answer, but her small fingers loosened just slightly on the collar, no longer gripping for dear life, but resting there, holding on in a quieter way. Kaiser gave a deep sigh, laying his head more heavily in her lap, and the tension in the room eased just a fraction. David sat back, exhaling slowly. He knew what Marilyn would say. Trust comes in inches, not miles. And right now, Sophie had given them an inch. She had admitted the cans were a secret, admitted her fear. That was the beginning. He rose quietly, stepping toward the window. Outside, the rain streaked down the glass in thin rivulets, blurring the grey shapes of the town beyond. He thought of his own childhood, of nights spent listening to slammed doors and voices raised too high. He remembered wishing someone would notice, someone would step in. Turning back, he looked at Sophie. She was still curled against Kaiser, her eyes half closed now, exhausted from the weight of saying even those few words. He knew this fight wasn't just about solvents and bruises. It was about teaching a little girl that secrets like these weren't hers to keep. That she had a right to be safe, to be heard, to be free. But for now, she had Kaiser, and Kaiser was enough. The shepherd blinked slowly, his gaze meeting David's across the room. No words were needed. The message was clear. She's not alone anymore. The hospital room had grown dim as late afternoon pressed its weight against the windows. The rain had slowed to a mist, soft streaks tracing patterns down the glass, and the hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. Sophie had finally drifted into a fragile sleep. Her small body curled into the crook of Kaiser's frame. The German shepherd lay pressed close to her side, his breathing slow and steady, his head resting lightly against the edge of the mattress. His presence was more than comfort. It was a vow carved in fur and bone. David Ramirez stood near the door, his uniform jacket folded over his arm. His shoulders sagged, not with defeat, but with the heaviness of decisions that could no longer be postponed. Marilyn Carter entered quietly, a folder tucked under her arm, her step soft but purposeful. She glanced once at Sophie, then at Kaiser, and lowered her voice instinctively. "She trusts him," Marilyn said, nodding toward the shepherd. David followed her gaze. Kaiser's ears flicked, acknowledging her voice without opening his eyes. "Yeah," David murmured. "Sometimes I think she only trusts him." "That's not a bad place to start," Marilyn replied, pulling out a chair. She set her folder on the small table and opened it, revealing intake forms, notes, and a protective services protocol checklist. "But it means we need to move carefully. If Kaiser is her anchor, we keep him close. No separation, not until she feels grounded." David dropped into the chair opposite her, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "What are our next steps?" Marilyn tapped her pen against the folder. "Temporary protective custody. It'll give us the legal authority to keep her here, away from her father, while we investigate further. We'll also request an emergency protection order. It's not permanent, but it creates a shield until the court can review the case." David nodded, jaw tightening. "And Owen Miller?" Her expression hardened at the name. "If the chemicals are what made her sick, and from what I've seen, that's almost certain, then he's at best negligent, at worst deliberately reckless. He exposed her to hazardous material, repeatedly." David leaned back, exhaling. The weight of that truth pressed heavy in his chest. "You think he knew what those canisters were?" Marilyn gave him a level look. "He's a painter, a contractor. He knows solvents. He knows the risks. The state's safety regulations are clear. If he brought those into his home, or worse, involved her in handling them, then yes, he knew." For a long moment, neither spoke. The soft rise and fall of Sophie's chest and Kaiser's steady breathing were the only sounds. Finally, David broke the silence. "I've seen this before. Different uniforms, different battlegrounds, but the same look in the eyes of kids who've been told they're weak for being hurt. It stays with them." He rubbed the tattoo on his forearm, a faded mark of his army years. "You can patch up the body, but it's the lies that scar deepest." Marilyn closed the folder gently. "Then we start by giving her the truth, that she's safe, that what happened wasn't her fault, and that people are finally listening." David's eyes flicked to Sophie, still curled into Kaiser's warmth. Her small fingers twitched in sleep, as if holding on even in dreams. "She told him," he murmured. "She told him when she was hurting, and he told her it was just a bug, that she was whining." His voice cracked. "What kind of man does that?" "The kind who's afraid of accountability," Marilyn said quietly. "But he won't be able to hide behind excuses this time. The medical reports, the evidence in her backpack, that's more than enough to open a case. And if your dog links it to something bigger—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing with thought. David straightened. "A warehouse fire, a year ago. Kaiser wouldn't leave the site. Same smell, same symbols. The case was buried as an accident." Marilyn's brow furrowed. "If that's true, we're not just looking at neglect. We're looking at corporate negligence. Maybe worse. This could reach further than Owen Miller's house. The thought sat between them like a shadow. Marilyn leaned forward, her voice firm. Then we need to secure Sophie first. Every system we have, medical, legal, protective, needs to be in place around her before we even think about going after the larger trail. Do you understand? David nodded, but his hands clenched into fists on the table. I understand, but I'm not letting this drop. Not if those same chemicals nearly killed her. Marilyn studied him for a long moment, then softened. Good. She'll need people like you in her corner. People who won't walk away when the paperwork gets thick. They both looked back at Sophie. Her face was pale against the pillow, framed by tangled strands of dark hair. But for the first time since the morning, there was no fear etched into her expression. Only exhaustion, softened by the presence of the shepherd, who refused to leave her side. Look at him, Marilyn whispered. That's what protection should look like. Steady, quiet, always there. David felt his throat tighten. He reached down, brushing his hand lightly across Kaiser's back. The dog stirred, opening one amber eye, then settled again, content in his watch. In that moment, the room felt like the eye of the storm. Fragile, temporary, but real. A connection had been made. Fragile threads of trust weaving between a frightened child, a relentless dog, a weary soldier turned cop, and a social worker who had once been the child in the bed. David leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth twitching in something close to a smile. Then, we start here, he said softly. With her, with us, and with him. Kaiser's tail thumped once against the mattress, as though in agreement. And in that quiet hospital room, beneath the hum of lights and the whisper of rain, the first line of defense had been drawn, not in statutes or protocols, but in the simple, unspoken promise that Sophie was no longer alone. The rain hadn't stopped all night. By morning, Ashwood Junction lay beneath a grey veil, gutters overflowing, every surface slick. David Ramirez parked his patrol SUV outside 214 Birch Hollow Road. The house sagged under neglect. Paint peeled in long strips, weeds choked the yard, and a broken tricycle rusted by the porch steps. Kaiser shifted in the passenger seat, ears pricked, restless. David glanced at the warrant folded in his pocket, thin paper carrying the weight of law, and of Sophie's whispered plea in the hospital. Don't take me home. Dad will be mad. He rubbed his jaw, then murmured, All right, partner. Let's see what kind of man we're dealing with. They stepped into the rain together. The air reeked of wet earth and something sharper, paint, solvents. Kaiser's muscles tensed, nostrils flaring. David knocked firmly. For a long beat, nothing. Then footsteps, and the door creaked open. Owen Miller filled the gap. Mid-40s, wiry, hair unkempt, hazel eyes bloodshot. His jaw worked restlessly as though chewing words he hadn't chosen yet. What? He barked. Mr. Miller, Officer Ramirez, Ashwood Police. We have a warrant to inspect your property. David held it out. For what? For evidence related to the condition of your daughter, Sophie Miller. A flicker crossed Owen's face. Fear, irritation, guilt. But it vanished under a scowl. He shoved the door wider. She's at the hospital. Probably just a bug. Kids get sick. David's jaw tightened. This isn't about a bug. We're here to make sure your home environment is safe. Owen's lips curled. Safe's a funny word. I've breathed in paint fumes for 20 years. Still here. Kaiser stepped forward, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Owen's stance faltered, eyes flicking to the shepherd. David let the silence weigh, then said evenly, "Step aside, or we'll do this the hard way." Owen's nostrils flared, but he moved. "Suit yourself. You won't find anything." The air inside hit like a wall, thick, stale, saturated with chemical bite. It clung to David's throat. The living room sprawled in clutter, buckets of paint stacked in corners, brushes rotting in jars, rags stiff with residue. Takeout boxes and beer cans crowded the coffee table, adding their stench to the fumes. Owen leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Told you. I bring my work home. Nothing illegal." David ignored him. Kaiser padded ahead, nose low, tail stiff, moving like a soldier across a battlefield. The kitchen was worse. Stacks of stained rags hung drying, tools scattered across counters. The linoleum seemed to be sweat solvent. David imagined Sophie trying to eat dinner here, each bite swallowed with poison. His gut clenched. He turned back. "Which room is hers?" "Down the hall," Owen muttered. "Last door." Kaiser was already moving. His ears flicked forward, body taut with alertness. David followed into the narrow hallway, carpet-stained, light flickering above. Then he smelled it, faint lavender, an echo of a child's attempt at sanctuary. He opened the door. Sophie's room looked almost normal. A pale yellow comforter smoothed on the bed, crayon rainbows taped to the walls, fairy tales lined neatly on a shelf. But the air told the truth. Heavy, poisoned, stronger even here. Kaiser froze in the center of the room, head snapping toward the closet. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. David knelt beside him. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd pressed his nose to the closet crack, paw scraping. David stood and opened it. Inside, folded clothes, a stack of small shoes, and a glove. Pink, patterned with stars. Child-sized, stiff, stained with green and red streaks, reeking of solvents. David's chest tightened. He pulled on latex gloves, lifted it carefully. The material crackled, saturated. Sophie's hands had been inside this, the same hands he'd seen clinging to Kaiser's fur in the hospital. Behind him, Owen's voice came sharp. "She plays with my stuff sometimes." "I tell her not to, but kids, this isn't curiosity," David cut in coldly. "This is contamination. Reckless." Owen's eyes darted away. "It's just a glove. Doesn't prove anything." Kaiser's growl deepened, vibrating through the room like a warning. David slipped the glove into an evidence bag. He scanned further. Discolored windowsills where solvent cans had rested. A stack of rags crusted stiff in the corner. On the bookshelf, between fairy tales, a tin canister with a peeling warning label, all bagged. When he looked back at the bed, comforter smoothed, rainbows taped on the wall, it hollowed him out. Sophie had tried to carve safety here, to build order in a room where the air itself could kill her. David's voice was quiet, steel-edged. "She tried to make this a safe place, and you poisoned it." Owen said nothing. His silence screamed. David sealed the bags and slid them into his satchel. The house had spoken louder than Owen ever could. Sophie's whispered fear had a smell now, a weight, evidence that couldn't be dismissed. He stepped toward the door, Kaiser brushing against his leg, steady and solid. The shepherd's amber eyes burned with the same vow David carried. They weren't leaving without tearing this prison down. The rain had slackened to a mist, but the sky above Ashwood Junction still hung heavy and grey, the kind of light that flattened everything into dull shades. David stepped through the back door of Owen Miller's house, boots sinking into the patchy, uneven lawn. The ground was soft with rain, mud clinging thick around the soles. Kaiser padded beside him, body taut, nose sweeping the air like a compass needle caught on a secret. The backyard told its own story. Half-dug holes scarred the ground, cinder blocks stacked haphazardly against the fence, rusted tools left out to drown in the weather. It was less a yard than a dumping ground, and even here, the acrid tang of solvents threaded the damp air. David paused near the sagging porch. The lattice skirting the base had rotted in places, wood splintering, gaps wide enough for Kaiser's nose to poke through. The shepherd froze, muscles stiff, tail rigid. His nostrils flared once, twice. Then he let out a deep, throaty growl and began pawing furiously at the damp soil. David's pulse quickened. "Easy, boy. What do you smell?" Kaiser ignored him, digging with the urgency of a dog that had found what no human eye could. Mud and clumps of grass scattered, his paws striking something solid beneath. David crouched, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. There it was, a corner of canvas, faded blue, half buried in the earth. Kaiser barked once, sharp and insistent, then stepped back to give David space. David pulled on a pair of gloves and reached into the hole. His fingers closed around the sodden fabric, stiff with age and weather. He tugged, and the ground gave way with a wet squelch. The bag came free, heavy, torn at the seams, its surface stamped faintly with a logo nearly obscured by dirt and mildew. David wiped it against his sleeve until the letters appeared clear enough to read, "East Line Freight." His stomach sank. It was the same company tied to the warehouse fire a year ago, the same insignia on the rusted canisters Sophie had carried in her backpack. He set the bag on the ground and unzipped it carefully. Inside, nestled in mud-stained rags, were several more canisters identical to the ones at the hospital. Their caps were rusted, labels peeling, warning symbols scarred but still visible. The air around them carried that same bitter, metallic tang that lingered in Sophie's clothes, and there was more. David reached deeper and pulled out a pair of gloves, child-sized, pale pink, patterned with faded stars. They were stiff, soaked through with streaks of dried yellow and green residue. His throat tightened as he held them up, mud dripping from the cuffs. He didn't need Dr. Patel to tell him what those stains meant. Behind him, Owen's voice rang out, sharp and defensive. "I don't know where that came from." David turned slowly. Owen stood near the porch steps, arms crossed, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted from the bag to the gloves to David's face, unable to land anywhere for long. "You don't know?" David's voice was calm, but edged with steel. "This bag was buried under your porch. It's got your daughter's gloves in it, and Eastline Freight's logo stamped clear as day." Owen shifted his weight, his jaw working. I do jobs for them sometimes. Subcontracting. That bag could have been left behind. I didn't tell her to touch it." Kaiser's growl rolled low, vibrating through the wet air. The shepherd stepped forward, ears flat, teeth just visible. David reached down, brushing his fingers against Kaiser's collar, grounding the dog and himself. "Left behind?" David repeated, holding Owen's gaze. "Buried under your porch, with gloves that fit your daughter's hands?" He raised the evidence-bagged gloves higher. "Don't insult me, Miller. I've seen a lot of bad excuses in my time, but this one's thin enough to choke on." Owen's face flushed, but he didn't answer. His silence was its own confession. David carefully bagged the canisters and gloves, his movements deliberate, every piece of evidence sliding into its plastic sleeve with the weight of truth. He glanced once at Kaiser, whose amber eyes burned steady on Owen, never wavering. "You exposed her," David said quietly. "Whether through neglect or intent, you let her breathe this poison. You let her carry it like a secret in her backpack, and now she's lying in a hospital bed because of it." For a heartbeat, Owen looked like he might argue. But then his eyes dropped. his shoulders sagging beneath the rain. "I didn't mean for it to get that bad," he muttered. David felt anger rise hot in his chest. He took one step closer, voice low and fierce. "Intent doesn't erase the damage. You can tell yourself whatever story helps you sleep at night. But those bruises, that rash, that pain she whispered about, that's on you." The rain pattered harder on the sagging porch roof. Kaiser's growl finally subsided, but his body stayed taut, as though ready to spring if Owen moved an inch closer. David zipped the evidence bags and stood, rain dripping from his gloves. The yard felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the truth itself had thickened it. He slipped the evidence into his satchel and turned to Kaiser. "Good work, partner," he murmured. The shepherd's tail flicked once, a silent reply. When David looked back at Owen, there was no fire left in the man's eyes, only a dull, flickering defiance. But David didn't need his admission. The ground had spoken, the bag had spoken, and Sophie's silence had already screamed the truth louder than words. David stepped past him toward the house, Kaiser close at his side. "This isn't over," he said flatly. "Not by a long shot." And with that, the rain carried their footsteps away, leaving Owen Miller standing in the wreckage of his own lies. The morning broke with a brittle light over Ashwood Junction. Low clouds left the world washed in grey. David Ramirez drove north along the county road, the SUV humming under him. Kaiser sat alert in the passenger seat, nose to the cracked window, every breath a map. In the back, the satchel rattled, evidence from Owen Miller's yard. Rusted canisters stamped with the East Line freight logo, the pink gloves stiff with solvent. Each item felt like a stone in David's chest, a weight dragging him back to a case that had never left. Nearly a year before, David had been at the edge of town when East Line freight went up in flames. Crews had smothered the fire. The official line read, "Faulty wiring." The file closed quickly, but David had watched Kaiser circle the charred lot then, growling low at half-buried metal drums. The dog's behavior had sat wrong with him, an insistence that had been written down, then ignored. Now Kaiser refused to forget, and neither had David. They crested the hill, and the warehouse lay ahead like a blackened skeleton. Corrugated metal hung in jagged strips. Weeds devoured the fence. David pulled onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. Rain fogged the air, and crows circled above. Kaiser was already poised, body taut with purpose. "Show me," David told him. They slipped through a gap in the fence. The lot still smelled of rust and chemicals. The years hadn't erased the tang. Kaiser threaded among a scatter of rusting barrels, nose sweeping low. Black streaks scarred the concrete where fire had seared hottest. He stopped, pawed at a patch near the collapsed loading bay, and then barked. Sharp, certain. David crouched. He pulled from the satchel the canister from Sophie's backpack. Even through plastic, the acrid odor rose. Kaiser's reaction was immediate. Ears forward, nostrils flaring, body primed as if recalling a battlefield scent. He snapped his head toward the ruined warehouse and barked again, tracking an invisible trail. The connection snapped into place. Sophie's canisters hadn't come from a random supply shed. They came from here. Inside the warehouse, the air was worse, metallic and sweet with solvent. Rows of barrels leaned drunkenly. Some were split, some scarred black. Puddles shimmered with rainbow sheens where chemicals had pooled. Kaiser's nails clicked on the concrete as he moved, every muscle in him keyed to certainty. He stopped and barked at a heap of debris. David brushed away soot to reveal a child's lunchbox, plastic scuffed but unmistakably for a little girl. A faded princess, mid-twirl. The lining was stained, the smell bitter and sharp. Not lost. Left. Kaiser led deeper. Under a sagging slab of corrugated metal, David found small shoes, mud-caked and frayed at the laces. 6-year-old shoes. Sophie's face popped into his mind. The hospital bed whispered words that had not wanted to be heard. Daddy said it was our secret project, and the little hand clutching Kaiser's collar like a lifeline. Evidence shifted from possible to undeniable. Someone had brought a child into this poisoned skeleton and left her. David sealed the lunchbox and shoes in evidence bags, hands steady though his chest tightened. He photographed the barrels, the residue, and the rainbow sheen in puddles. Every shutter click felt like a heartbeat, proof that the fire had been more than an accident. The GPS pin was dropped, notes typed. Eastline Freight, fire site. Child's belongings recovered, evidence of chemical exposure, possible foul play. Kaiser kept moving, nose low. He poured until rust and soil gave way to a scorched fragment bearing the same triangular warning symbol as the canisters found in Sophie's backpack. David slid it into a bag and felt the weight of certainty sink in. The items from Sophie's home traced straight back to Eastline. The file that had been closed with a shrug reopened itself, glaring. Outside, rain stitched the ruined roof. David thought of home, of Sophie's whispered fear in the hospital, of the rash blooming on her skin, the glove with solvent stiff as a grave marker, and he felt the outrage he'd tried to box away. This wasn't merely about a negligent parent or an unlucky accident. It smelled of cover-up, of intent, of people who wanted a dangerous truth buried beneath ash. He remembered how his initial questions after the fire had been met with polite indifference, reports smoothed edges. Inspectors' notes omitted unease. Powerful hands had the habit of making problems disappear. Now Sophie's tiny shoes and a princess lunchbox lay in his satchel, mute witnesses to a conspiracy that could no longer be ignored. Kaiser pressed into David's leg, a warm, living anchor. David crouched and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You were right, boy," he whispered. "You were right then. You're right now." The shepherd's amber eyes stayed fierce and unbowed, fixed on the dark heart of the warehouse, as if daring it to speak. David steadied himself and took one last wide photograph. The collapsed beams, the rows of drums, the ruined floor scarred with burns. The image captured context, the scale of decay, the evidence, the place where a child's life had nearly unraveled. He slipped the phone into his pocket and sealed the satchel. They left the warehouse together, the place shrinking into mist behind them, but the scent of truth clung like smoke. As David and Kaiser walked back through the sagging fence and the weeds, he felt something larger settle over the lot. Not just ruin, but a map. The markers pointed off the property, into paperwork, into invoices, into the hands that signed the reports. Back at the SUV, David tapped through his photos, each one a promise to Sophie and to himself. He thought of the system that had smoothed the fire into accidental and knew the forces arrayed against him. He thought of Sophie's small, feverish whisper, how easily a child's plea had been brushed aside, and felt his duty sharpen into resolve. "We don't stop now, partner," he told Kaiser, voice low and hard with intent. "No matter who tries to shut us down." Kaiser barked once, a sound that echoed off the wet road and the low sky like an oath. David slung the satchel over his shoulder, heavier than it had been that morning, and started the engine. The GPS pin glowed on the screen, coordinates logged forever. The rain beat steady against the windshield, as they drove away from the carcass of Eastline freight. But the storm, David felt, was already gathering in the rooms where decisions were made and reports were written. This time the truth had survived the fire. Sophie's belongings, a soldier's persistence, and a dog's unrelenting nose for what had been buried. The courthouse annex smelled faintly of dust and floor polish. Fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of filing cabinets as mist settled over Ashwood Junction. Marilyn Carter sat hunched at a wooden table, her blazer draped on the chair, exhaustion creasing her brow. Before her towered a stack of forgotten case files, faded ink, routine stamps, nothing remarkable. But she wasn't here out of duty. She was here because Sophie's silence was screaming. The girl had never once spoken of her mother, only her father, only projects and colors. Marilyn knew that kind of silence. She'd worn it herself once. She flipped open another file and froze. Melissa Miller, Sophie's mother. The records were old, yellowing. Melissa had filed for legal protection from Owen Miller, citing controlling behavior, financial isolation, and chemicals. She'd mentioned Eastline freight. She feared for Sophie's safety, but the file ended abruptly. Petitioner withdrew claim. No further action taken. No follow-up. No closure. Marilyn sat back, heart pounding. This wasn't withdrawal. It was erasure. She whispered to the empty room. She never left willingly. Footsteps echoed. David Ramirez appeared in the doorway, uniform damp from the rain, Kaiser at his side. "You've been at this all night?" he asked. Marilyn nodded and pushed the file toward him. Melissa tried to get out. She tried to protect Sophie. David scanned it, jaw tightening. And then someone made her disappear on paper. Exactly. I've seen this before. Women silenced, erased, made to look like they gave up. Her voice wavered. I grew up thinking my mom abandoned me. Turns out she died fighting for me. The truth broke me, but it also freed me. David looked her in the eye. So what are you saying? I think Melissa didn't walk away. I think she was pushed. If she's still alive, we have to find her, for Sophie, to give her the truth, not Owen's version. David tapped the file once. Then we've already found her. We just have to prove it. Kaiser let out a low whine, ears perked. David nodded to him. For Sophie. Marilyn smiled faintly. For Sophie. The hospital room was quiet but taut. The monitors beeped soft against the patter of rain. Sophie lay curled under her blanket, her hand resting in Kaiser's fur. The shepherd lay beside her like a sentry, his eyes never leaving her. David sat nearby, watching the way her fingers twitched, then stilled. Then her voice broke the silence. Soft, barely air. Daddy said, "They're our secret project." David's body tensed. What do you mean, Sophie? She didn't look at him. She buried her face into Kaiser's neck. The cans, the shiny ones. He said we were making special colors. But if I told, they'd take me away. He said I'd never see him again. Her small shoulders shook. David's chest tightened. He'd read this kind of manipulation, but hearing it in her voice, it cut deeper. Kaiser licked her hand gently, a quiet vow that he was listening. You're safe, David whispered. No one will take you away because you told. You did the right thing. Her eyes peeked up, full of tears. But I broke the rule. I told. Sweetheart, David said, crouching beside her. Don't ever apologize for the truth. This is not your fault. Not one bit. He got mad when I cried, she sniffled. Said it was just a bug. But it hurts all the time. Her hand pressed to her ribs. David fought for composure. I believe you, and the doctors believe you. You're not weak. You're the bravest little girl I've ever met. A flicker of something crossed her face. Hope. I told him the colors smelled funny, she murmured. He yelled. Said secrets make families strong. David's throat burned. Owen had twisted her trust into poison. You don't have to keep his secrets anymore, David said gently. You only need to protect yourself now, and we're going to help you do that. Sophie blinked. What if he finds me? David pointed to Kaiser. Do you see him? He won't let anyone hurt you, and neither will I. The shepherd gave a low rumble, a promise in canine form. Sophie let out a tiny, tearful laugh. Okay. She rested her head back. Her hand still clung to Kaiser's collar as sleep finally took her. David watched the rise and fall of her chest and knew the wall had cracked. The healing had begun. Then the door burst open. Owen Miller stood in the frame, soaked and wild-eyed. I want to see my daughter. Sophie jolted upright, heart monitor spiking. I'm sorry, she cried. I didn't mean to tell. Please don't be mad. She shook violently. The machine screamed in alarm. David stepped between them instantly. Mr. Miller, you can't be here. There's a court order. She's mine, Owen shouted. You can't keep her from me. Sophie sobbed, curling into Kaiser. The shepherd rose in a flash, placing himself on the bed between Sophie and her father, ears back, hackles raised, but silent. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. His amber eyes locked onto Owen like a blade. One step, and there would be consequences. Get that dog off her, Owen barked. She's mine. She belongs safe, David replied, voice low and lethal. His hand hovered near his holster. From the hallway, nurses whispered into radios. Security was coming. My dad used to say, don't show weakness, Owen ranted. I was just trying to protect her, David snapped. By making her breathe poison, by hitting her when she cried. That's not protection. That's fear. Owen's mask cracked. He punched the wall. Sophie screamed. Kaiser didn't move, but the rumble that came from him was not just warning, it was judgment. Security arrived. Calm, firm. Sir, you need to leave. Owen's shoulders sagged. His fight drained. She's all I had, he muttered as they led him out. Sophie didn't look at him. The room went still. David crouched beside the bed. He can't hurt you anymore. Not ever again. Sophie's voice shook. Promise? David looked at Kaiser. The shepherd rested his head on her chest, his tail tapping once, slow and certain. Promise, David said. Sophie's sobs faded into hiccups. She curled into the dog, murmuring one last truth before sleep took her. I was so scared. David smoothed the blanket over her. Outside, the rain had started again, tracing tears across the glass. But inside, the room had changed. This was no longer a space of fear. It was the beginning of healing. The courthouse annex in Ashwood Junction smelled of dust and paper, a place where secrets lay buried beneath decades of ink. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on rows of filing cabinets that stretched into the gloom. Outside, rain tapped against the high windows, a steady reminder of the storm pressing down on the town. Officer David Ramirez rubbed his temples, fatigue gnawing behind his eyes. He'd been here since dawn, long after Owen Miller's outburst at the hospital. Sophie's trembling voice still haunted him, her whispered apology for telling, her desperate grip on Kaiser's fur as though the shepherd were her only anchor. David had promised she was safe. Now he had to make that promise real. Kaiser sat at his side, ears pricked, nose twitching at the musty air. His amber eyes followed David's every move as he pulled open drawer after drawer. The files seemed endless. Safety reports, inspection summaries, violation notices. Most were trivial, missing harnesses, outdated extinguishers. But David knew from the military that danger often hid in the margins, disguised as routine. Then his fingers froze on a folder stamped East Line Freight, Incident Reports, 2021-2022. He spread the yellowed pages on the desk. Early reports were mundane equipment failures. But in April 2022, one stood out. Employee reported dizziness, nausea, and rash from exposure to unsealed drums of solvent-based coating materials. The supervisor noted residue near racks. Complaint marked internal resolution. The report was signed by Joseph Stein, safety inspector. David frowned, scanning the addendum. Stein had urged a temporary shutdown until ventilation improved, flagging dozens of unlabeled canisters. His recommendation had been crossed out in heavy black pen. Stamped across the page. Resolved internally. The phrase echoed in David's mind like a drumbeat. He'd seen it before. Corporate shorthand for silence. A neat burial of liability. Kaiser whined, nudging David's elbow. "Yeah, boy," David muttered. "I see it too." Stein's name surfaced again in other complaints, always ending the same way. Internal resolution. Until one report stopped mid-sentence. A supervisor's terse note replaced his handwriting. Inspector reassigned. Case closed. David leaned back, exhaling. He didn't believe for a second Stein had been reassigned. More likely, he'd been pushed aside, his warnings buried with him. And now, years later, Sophie carried those same chemicals in her backpack. At the back of the file, David found a faded log from a warehouse fire north of town, the very site where Sophie's lunchbox had been discovered. The report claimed minor damage, no injuries, but faint beneath the smudges were Stein's original notes. Children's items found near a storage area. Lunchboxes, shoes. David's breath caught. He pressed his palms to the desk, grounding himself. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a chain, each link forged from negligence and silence. And at the end of that chain was a child. Kaiser shifted closer, resting his chin on David's thigh, amber eyes searching his. David scratched his ears absently. "We're not imagining this, partner." They covered it up. They let it happen. David closed the folder, his decision clear. He would find Joseph Stein, dead, retired, or silenced. Somewhere in Stein's trail lay proof. Eastline knew the danger and buried it. That proof could save Sophie. He slipped the file into his bag, Sophie's frightened whisper replaying in his mind. "What if he finds me?" The rain outside had slowed when David left the archives, but the clouds still pressed heavy over Ashwood Junction. Somewhere beneath them, the truth waited, buried under years of lies, and he would dig it out, piece by piece. For Sophie, for every child forced into silence. Across town, the Child Protective Services office was quiet. Most staff had gone home. Marilyn Carter sat alone at her desk, a single lamp throwing amber light across towers of folders and her battered laptop. Her shoulders ached, but she pressed on. Sophie Miller's haunted eyes had carved too deep a weight in her chest to let her rest. She couldn't forget how Sophie had clung to Kaiser at the hospital, as though only the shepherd could shield her. No child should have to rely on a dog to feel safe. But Sophie's whispered apologies, her desperate clutching of fur, told Marilyn everything. She'd been taught to fear love, doubt kindness, and trust silence. Marilyn opened a database, fingers moving fast. Years in the foster system had taught her that even vanished names left traces. She searched for Sophie's mother, Melissa Miller. The official file claimed Melissa had abandoned her daughter 3 years ago. But Marilyn, raised in foster care herself, knew the stories written in ink rarely matched the scars etched into lives. She scrolled until a line stopped her cold. Application for Protective Custody Support, July 2022. Petitioner, Melissa Miller. Heart racing, she opened the scan. Melissa had written that her daughter was being exposed to unsafe chemical materials brought home from Owen's job. She requested temporary relocation, citing fear of retaliation. The form was stamped and received by Legal Aid Services of Douglas County. But at the bottom, one line made Marilyn's stomach drop. Case withdrawn. Withdrawn. Attached was a terse note. Petitioner requested closure. Declined to pursue action. Marilyn shook her head. A mother desperate enough to put fears in writing didn't just walk away, unless someone forced her. She dug deeper, calling colleagues across state lines. Hours passed. Coffee grew cold. Finally, a reply came. A scanned envelope, postmarked from Great Falls, Montana. The sender's name, Melissa Carter. Marilyn's throat tightened. Melissa hadn't abandoned her child. She'd been trying to reach her. A foster intake clerk in Montana had added a note. Melissa sought help reconnecting with her daughter. All mailings to the Vermont address were returned, marked undeliverable. She reported threats of losing custody if she continued. She works at a bakery in Great Falls, still requesting updates whenever possible. Melissa was alive, not vanished. Alive and fighting from afar. Marilyn dug further and found court dockets showing intercepted letters, mail redirected through Owen's family, stamped refused. Owen hadn't only poisoned Sophie's body, he'd poisoned her connection to her mother. Tears stung Marilyn's eyes. She remembered her own childhood, the unopened letters she used to wait for, the ache of wondering if her mother had ever tried. Sophie carried the same wound, except now Marilyn held the proof. Melissa had never stopped trying. A knock broke her reverie. David stood in the doorway, hair damp from mist, Kaiser at his side. The shepherd's eyes glowed in the lamp's light. "You're still here," David said quietly. "So are you," Marilyn replied. She turned the laptop toward him. "I found her, Melissa. She's alive, in Montana." David leaned closer, jaw tightening as he read the returned letters, the threats. Kaiser shifted, sensing his anger, resting a paw on his boot. "She never left willingly," David murmured. "He made sure of it." Marilyn nodded, eyes glistening. "Sophie needs to know. Not yet. Not until she's safe. But this changes everything. Melissa didn't abandon her. She was pushed out. And she's been fighting to get back ever since." The silence between them carried a weight of fury and hope. Outside, mist curled around courthouse lamps. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cut through the night. "Then we find her," David said simply. For the first time in years, Marilyn felt the truth pulling taut, weaving stronger than the lies. Melissa was alive. Sophie's story was no longer just survival. It was about reunion. Past midnight, the precinct was nearly dark. Only a few desk lamps glowed, vending machines humming in the hall. Rain tapped gently on the windows. David sat at his desk, paperwork spread but untouched. His hand hovered over a travel request form. Interstate clearance for a child protection case. Vermont to Montana. Melissa Carter. All he had to do was fill it in. But his chest tightened with hesitation. Not about Sophie, but about his past. At his feet, Kaiser paced restlessly, nails clicking. He rarely unsettled indoors, but tonight he wouldn't lie still. David looked down. Kaiser's amber eyes held steady, urging him forward. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Memories came like old wounds reopening. El Paso, stucco walls, a father's voice like thunder. The slam of doors, his mother's hunched shoulders, hiding in closets with his little brother, whispering promises he couldn't keep. I'll protect you. But he hadn't. His brother grew up scarred, addiction swallowing him whole. David had stood at his graveside, chest hollow, knowing silence had killed him as much as the drugs. Now Sophie's fragile voice echoed in his mind. Don't take me home. Daddy will be mad. He clenched his fist. Not again, he whispered. Not another kid. He pressed pen to paper, signing the travel request with a firm stroke. Purpose. Locate Melissa Carter, mother of minor Sophie Miller. At his feet, Kaiser chuffed softly, as if approving. Moments later, his phone buzzed. A text from Marilyn. Melissa's address confirmed. Great Falls, Montana. She's waiting. David exhaled, tension loosening. He closed his laptop, slid the signed form into the outbox, and stood. The empty desks around him were reminders of cases gone cold. But not this one. This one mattered too much. Kaiser rose immediately, ears sharp, pacing at his side. Yeah, I know, David murmured, grabbing his coat. We've got miles to go. He paused at the window. The rain had slowed, lamps glowing in mist. He thought of Sophie in her hospital bed. Kaiser curled protectively around her. He thought of Melissa in Montana, her letters returned unopened. And he thought of himself as a boy, praying for someone to step through the door and say, "You don't have to carry this anymore." He had never heard those words. But Sophie would. David turned off the lamp, leaving the office in shadow. He walked down the hall, Kaiser trotting close, scars of the past, now fuel for the fight ahead. By the time he pushed through the precinct doors into the Vermont night, his choice was no longer professional. It was personal. Sophie deserved her mother. Melissa deserved her daughter. And he would be the bridge that carried them back together. Kaiser lifted his head to the rain, tail steady, ears pricked. David followed his gaze into the dark. Tomorrow, he whispered. We start tomorrow. The morning David and Kaiser left Vermont, Ashwood Junction lay wrapped in fog. The streets were slick, storefronts shuttered, the church steeple fading into gray. Sophie was still in her hospital bed, safe for now, under Marilyn's watch. David's promise to her, that he would find her mother, pressed heavy on his chest as he steered the patrol SUV onto the open road. Kaiser stood with his paws braced against the passenger window, nose fogging the glass. When David rolled it down, the shepherd thrust his head into the rushing wind, ears flapping, eyes alight. For the first time in days, he looked unburdened. Feels good, huh, partner? David said. Kaiser barked once, sharp and clear. Better than hospitals. Better than courtrooms. As miles unfurled, the fog thinned. Vermont's forests gave way to farmland, red barns, and thawing fields stretching under a pale blue sky. David breathed deep, realizing how suffocating the past weeks had been. The tense, hospital corridors, Owen Miller's looming shadow. Out here, the horizon felt wider, though Sophie's face never left his mind. Her trembling voice, "Don't take me home. Daddy will be mad." The way she clutched Kaiser's fur like a lifeline. David glanced at the shepherd now, ears cutting through the wind. Kaiser was built for freedom. Yet he had anchored himself to Sophie in that hospital room, refusing to leave her side. The contrast seared David. A child, caged in silence, a dog allowed to run. By midday, the road bent into plains. Kaiser settled onto the seat, chest rising steadily, but his ears flicked whenever David's focus wavered, as if reminding him, "Stay the course." David murmured, "We won't stop." At sunset, he pulled into a rest stop, stretching stiff muscles. Kaiser bounded out, circling, then tore across the grass in a burst of joy. Mud clumped beneath his paws, tongue lolling. David watched, a warmth blooming in his chest. There was healing in motion. No secrets, no fear, just freedom. He thought of Sophie. She had never run like that. Her laughter had always sounded borrowed. He wanted to see it unchained. Darkness fell, and David leaned against the SUV, Montana pulling at his bones. Melissa Carter was alive. Silenced, threatened, but alive. He would bring her back. Kaiser pressed his head against David's hand, warm and solid. "We'll find her," David whispered. "For Sophie, for all of us." They drove on into the night, headlights carving west. Morning in Great Falls smelled of flour and sugar. The air carried the sweetness of bread rising from a corner bakery. Behind it stood a modest rental house with white trim, a scooter leaning against the steps, its pink ribbon frayed. David parked at the curb, heart thudding. Kaiser shifted in the passenger seat, ears twitching, as if he sensed what was coming. "You ready, partner?" David murmured. Kaiser gave a low chuff. David climbed the porch steps. The screen door creaked open before he knocked. A woman stepped out, flour dusting her apron, auburn hair pulled back. She froze at the sight of the uniform. "Mrs. Carter?" David asked gently. She nodded warily. "Yes, I'm Melissa. Is something wrong? Has something happened?" David took a careful step closer. "My name is Officer David Ramirez. I came from Ashwood Junction, Vermont. It's about your daughter." Her hands flew to her mouth. "Sophie?" The name cracked in her throat. "Please, tell me." "She's alive," David said firmly. "Safe. She's in the hospital, recovering, but she's safe." Melissa collapsed onto the porch step, sobs tearing free. "Oh God, I thought I lost her forever." Kaiser padded forward, pressing his nose against her arm. She startled, then let out a broken laugh through tears, stroking his head. "And who are you? Her guardian angel?" David's throat tightened. "In a way, this is Kaiser. He's the one who found her." Melissa wept harder, burying her face in his fur. Kaiser leaned into her, tail sweeping the porch slowly. David pulled a folded piece of cloth from his pocket, a faded pink scarf. "We found this in Sophie's room. She kept it." Melissa gasped, clutching it to her chest. "I made this the winter before I left." She pressed it to her face, fresh tears spilling. She never let it go. David sat beside her, letting the silence carry the weight. This wasn't just relief. It was years of silenced attempts breaking open. "When can I see her?" she asked finally, voice raw. "As soon as possible," David promised. "We'll go through the court, but the path is clear now. She needs you, and you need her." For the first time, fire flickered in her grief. Resolve. She took his hand, trembling but firm. He said softly, "You've carried this alone too long. It ends here." Inside her small kitchen, the air was warm with cinnamon and yeast. A tea kettle hissed on the stove. Melissa gripped Sophie's scarf at the table, as though it tethered her to life. Kaiser lay on the floor between them, watchful, every so often lifting his head to glance from Melissa to David. "She still smells like lavender," Melissa whispered. "I bought that shampoo even when we couldn't afford it." "I wanted her to smell like flowers, not chemicals." David swallowed, waiting. Her eyes burned with fierceness. "Everyone thinks I abandoned Sophie, but I didn't. They forced me." "Tell me," David said gently. Melissa set the scarf down, hands trembling. "It started with Owen's job at East Line Freight. At first, paint cans, then larger containers, unmarked, stacked in our basement, in Sophie's closet, even her playshed. I begged him to keep them away. He laughed, said she needed to get used to it." Her voice shook with anger. "I filed for protection. 2 days later, Owen's brother cornered me outside work, told me if I didn't drop it, I'd lose Sophie forever. He said Eastline had friends in the courthouse, that I was powerless." David's jaw tightened. He could picture it. The quiet threats, the system bending to protect men like Owen. Melissa's voice faltered. "That night, Owen came home. He didn't hit me. He just held one of Sophie's stuffed animals, squeezed it until the seams split, then dropped it in the trash. I knew then, if I pushed, Sophie would pay the price." Tears blurred her eyes. "So I left. They told me if I walked away she'd be safe. But it was a lie." David asked quietly, "And the letters?" Melissa rose, retrieving a bundle tied with twine. She laid it on the table. Dozens of envelopes, stamps faded, each marked "Return to sender," "Refused." I wrote every week. Birthdays, Christmas, first days of school. I told her I loved her. Everyone came back. Sometimes unopened, sometimes torn. I thought maybe she never even knew I tried. Do you think she hated me? Before David could answer, Kaiser stirred. The shepherd rose, planting one paw on the table. He sniffed the letters, then the scarf, tail giving a faint wag. Deliberately, he nudged the scarf toward Melissa and looked at David, as if to say, "This is hers. She belongs with Sophie." Melissa broke, sobbing openly as she clutched the scarf. Kaiser pressed his head to her knee, solid as stone. David leaned forward, voice steady. "She never hated you. She kept this scarf close. She carried you with her. In the only way a child can. She knew her mother's love never left." Melissa's tears shifted into hope. She gripped both scarf and David's hand. He held her gaze. "We'll fix this. We'll bring you back to her. And this time, no lies, no company, no threats will stop it." Melissa whispered through tears, "Hold on, baby girl. Mama's coming." Kaiser sat back on his haunches, tail sweeping the floor. His eyes glowed in the warm kitchen light. A silent witness to truth finally spoken. The conference room at Ashwood Junction's courthouse wasn't built for hope. Beige walls, buzzing lights, and a scarred oak table had heard more denials than dreams. But that morning, something fragile stirred. David sat at one end, sleeves rolled, photos spread before him. Sophie's bruises, chemical rashes, the canisters stacked in Owen's yard. Each image seared his mind, but he forced himself to look. Evidence had to be seen, carried, wielded. Beside him, Marilyn scribbled legal notes, eyes sharp despite fatigue. She had spent the night combing case law, determined to leave no gap Owen's lawyers could exploit. Across the table, Melissa clutched Sophie's pink scarf like both shield and sword. Her hands trembled, but her gaze held steady. At the far end, Sophie sat quietly with crayons scattered before her. Kaiser sprawled at her feet, ears twitching. When David glanced over, his chest tightened. Sophie had drawn herself under a crooked roof, rain falling in blue lines. Beside her stood Kaiser, drawn bold and proud. Above, in uneven letters, "He found me." David touched the page gently. "This is beautiful," Sophie whispered. "It's true. He found me when nobody else did." Melissa's tears brimmed as she stroked her daughter's hair. Marilyn leaned forward. "Can we admit this? It's not conventional, but—" David nodded. Truth is clearest when spoken by a child. Hours passed as they built the case. Medical reports paired with photos, Melissa's stack of returned letters photographed for record. Each envelope stamped, "Refused" proved intent. "He cut her off from her mother deliberately," David said. Marilyn added them to the binder, her pen flying. Melissa's voice shook. "He'll say I left willingly, that I was unfit." David leaned closer. "Then we'll show the truth. You never stopped fighting. Sophie's alive because she carried your love with her." Sophie held up another drawing, herself in a field of flowers, holding hands with a tall, red-haired woman. Between them, Kaiser wagged his tail. Above, "Me, Mama, Kaiser." Melissa covered her mouth, sobbing softly. "She remembers me." "Of course," David murmured. "Some bonds can't be erased." Kaiser rose, pressing against Sophie's shoulder, then leaning far enough for Melissa's hand to brush his fur too. "Guardian, bridge, witness." David finally spoke. "Tomorrow we walk into that courtroom, not just with evidence, with Sophie's story, and once it's told, there's no going back." Melissa clutched the scarf tighter. "Then let's tell it." The next morning, the courthouse loomed gray against the winter sky. Inside, silence pressed heavy. Melissa sat at the petitioner's table, her hair braided neatly, scarf in her lap. Across the aisle, Owen's chair sat empty. Only his attorney appeared, briefcase bristling with denials. In the gallery, Sophie sat beside Marilyn, Kaiser curled at her feet. David sat just behind, uniform crisp, eyes steady. Sophie had whispered she was too scared to sit closer, so Kaiser stayed, her living reassurance. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge, silver-haired with a gaze like steel, entered and noted Owen's absence with a frown. Then the state's case began. Marilyn rose first, her voice calm but cutting. She described Sophie found alone in the rain, bruises mapped across her skin, rashes from chemical burns. Photographs filled the evidence board. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Melissa shut her eyes, while Sophie pressed her face into Kaiser's fur. The shepherd brushed her hand with his tail. "Safe now." Dr. Hayes, the pediatrician, testified next. His voice was clinical, unflinching. Bruises inconsistent with accidental falls. Burns consistent with solvent exposure. This was chronic neglect. The defense tried to suggest clumsiness, but Hayes shot back. Bruises don't pattern like restraint marks. Rashes don't mimic industrial burns without cause. This was exposure. David followed. He described Kaiser pulling him to the bus stop. Sophie curled in the rain, whispering, "Don't take me home. Dad will be mad." His voice caught but steadied. He described the backpack of canisters, the stench of solvents at the Miller house. The defense called it circumstantial. David's jaw hardened. "I've seen solvent fires overseas. I know the signs." Sophie wasn't near danger. She was placed in it. Finally, Melissa took the stand. Her hands shook, but her voice rang clear. She told of threats, of Owen's brother cornering her in a parking lot, of signing papers under duress. She described the letters. Everyone returned, stamped, refused. She held up an envelope. "This isn't proof of my absence. It's proof of his control. I never stopped fighting." The defense shifted uneasily, but without Owen, their rebuttal was hollow. Then the quietest testimony came. Sophie stepped forward, clutching her folder of drawings. She laid them on the table. Kaiser finding her at the bus stop, Sophie hiding among barrels, Sophie standing between her mama and the dog. Above one picture, me, Mama, Kaiser. The judge studied them for a long time. Sophie whispered, "He told me not to tell. He said it was our secret." But Kaiser knew. He knew I was in trouble. The silence that followed was heavy. Melissa sobbed softly in the gallery. The defense objected, but the judge cut him off. Children express truth in many ways. I find this admissible. Her voice carried conviction. By the time testimony ended, the evidence was overwhelming. Owen's absence echoed louder than any argument. Melissa's presence, Sophie's drawings, David's account, and Kaiser's silent witness filled the room with truth no one could deny. The courtroom stilled as the judge set her notes aside. Her voice rang firm. This court has reviewed the evidence. Medical reports, sworn testimony, physical proof of chemical exposure, and the deliberate obstruction of communication. Custody of Sophie Miller is hereby restored to her mother, Melissa Carter. Effective immediately, Melissa gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Tears streamed unchecked. In the gallery, Sophie blinked rapidly, lips parted. She looked at David, then Marilyn, waiting. David bent close. "It's real, Sophie. She's yours again, and you're hers." The child bolted forward, shoes pattering across the floor, echoing through the hushed courtroom. Kaiser bounded after her. Melissa rose just as Sophie leapt into her arms. The scarf slipped between them, binding mother and daughter like a thread never broken. "Mommy," Sophie sobbed. "I knew you didn't leave me. I knew." Melissa clutched her, crying into her hair. "Never, baby girl. Never. They tried to take me, but I never let go." The courtroom dissolved into the background. Clerks, attorneys, even the judge, fading before this undeniable truth. A child's sobs turning to laughter, a mother's shoulders shaking with release, a bond reforged. Kaiser pressed against Sophie's leg, tail wagging harder, amber eyes bright. Guardian, bridge, witness. Even the judge's voice softened as she cleared her throat. "Truth has a way of finding light. Miss Carter, Miss Miller, your path will not be easy, but it is yours again. Protect it." Melissa kissed her daughter's hair, whispering promises. In the gallery, Marilyn wiped her eyes. David sat back, shoulders loosening for the first time in weeks. The fight with Eastline wasn't over, but this battle was won. Sophie pulled back, eyes glowing with trust. "Can Kaiser come with us? Please. He's the reason I'm here." Melissa laughed through her tears, looking down at the shepherd. His tail thumped once, hopeful. "Of course, sweetheart. He's family now." Kaiser barked once, sharp and joyful. A ripple of chuckles spread through the gallery. Even the judge allowed the faintest smile. As the bailiff called adjournment, Melissa caught David's gaze, mouthing a silent thank you. He nodded, glancing at Kaiser, who wagged once more, amber eyes glowing like embers. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Mother, daughter, and dog walked out together into the crisp Vermont air. The sky stretched wide and clear, and the future finally seemed possible. The headlines came slowly at first, tucked between politics and weather. But soon they were everywhere, on diner counters in Ashwood Junction, on the front page of the Burlington Times, and across living rooms when the evening news began. Eastline Freight found liable for child chemical exposure. Executives dismissed after OSHA DEQ investigation. Warehouse to be permanently decommissioned. For years, Eastline had operated like a shadow, its trucks crossing highways unnoticed, its warehouses leaking solvents into silence. But Sophie Miller's whisper in the rain dragged it into the light. The investigation was relentless. Photos of bruises, medical reports of liver damage, the canisters in Sophie's backpack, all pieced into a mosaic no lawyer could dismantle. Testimony followed. David Ramirez on the abandoned warehouse, Marilyn Carter on the intercepted letters, Melissa on the threats that drove her into hiding. Together, their voices built an unshakable wall of truth. When the gavel had fallen, it hadn't just reunited a child with her mother. It cracked Eastline's armor. OSHA and the DEQ fined the company more than $250,000. Executives resigned in a cascade. The operations director, the inspector who buried complaints, the counsel who drafted Melissa's coerced silence. The warehouse itself was fenced off, plastered with hazard signs, slated for demolition. On the courthouse steps, Eastline issued a polished statement. We deeply regret the oversights that led to harm. We are committed to transparency and ensuring nothing like this ever happens again. To some, it was enough. To Melissa, watching from her rented cottage, it was hollow. She shut off the TV and looked at Sophie laughing on the rug with Kaiser. You don't erase years of silence with one sentence, she whispered. David agreed, crumpling the statement over morning coffee at the precinct. Justice wasn't in their words. It was in Sophie finally sleeping through the night. Marilyn, though, found hope. Sophie's case had set a precedent. Maybe the next child wouldn't have to whisper in the rain to be heard, but scars lingered. Sophie still woke trembling, whispering apologies until Kaiser nudged her awake. Melissa flinched at the rumble of trucks. David still carried Owen Miller's shadow in his mind. And the town of Ashwood Junction, once complicit in silence, now carried a plaque on the courthouse wall, in honor of Sophie Carter, whose voice reminded us that every child deserves to be heard. David stood before it one evening, Kaiser at his side. He traced the words, then looked down at his partner. Justice served, huh? His voice held no triumph, only weariness, but also peace. Melissa's cottage sat at the edge of Maple Hollow, shutters faded green, garden overgrown. But it was enough. For Sophie, it was freedom. Her first night there, she whispered into her pillow, "Don't let him find me." Kaiser's tail thumped once on the floorboards. Not here, not ever. Life slowly gathered color again, like watercolor spreading across dry paper. Melissa worked part-time at a bakery, her hands dusted with flour instead of fear. Sophie joined art therapy. At first, she only painted storms, gray lines, puddles, a small, hunched figure. Melissa wept in the car. But the next week, Sophie painted Kaiser, bold and strong, with David beside him. Beneath them, she scrawled, "The first ones who stayed." When Melissa showed David, he couldn't speak. He just traced the crayon lines, throat tight, while Kaiser huffed as if to remind him he hadn't done it alone. David began visiting on Tuesdays and Saturdays, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with books. Sophie would fling her arms around Kaiser's neck as if a week apart was too long. Her laughter filled the house like birdsong. Rhythms formed. Saturday mornings with David fixing porch boards as Sophie supervised with a toy hammer. Tuesday evenings with Melissa brewing tea while Sophie showed her newest drawings. Some were bright, houses, fields. Others still carried shadows, barrels, dark rooms, but always with Kaiser, and now often David, by her side. One evening, Sophie held out a picture, the three of them in a meadow, Kaiser in front, the sun shining not just above, but from them. "This is our family," she whispered. "If that's okay." David crouched, his voice rough. "It's more than okay, Sophie." It's the best thing I've ever seen." Kaiser pressed his nose to the page, smudging it, making Sophie giggle. Life wasn't perfect. Sophie still startled at sudden noises. Melissa still woke from nightmares. David carried ghosts of his own. But light poured into the cracks. Sophie's paintings brightened. Melissa hummed while kneading dough. And David, who had lived in shadows, found himself laughing on the cottage porch as Sophie tried to braid Kaiser's tail. Spring exhaled over Ashwood Junction. On the church lawn near Maple Hollow, grass shimmered under late sun. Sophie ran barefoot through it, her yellow dress fluttering, laughter ringing bright and unbroken. Each step was a declaration. She was no longer the child whispering, "Don't take me home," under rain. She was something new. Lighter, freer, joy stitched by second chances. Kaiser lay under a maple, relaxed, but watchful, amber eyes tracking her every move. His role had shifted, from shield in the storm to witness in the sunlight. Melissa sat on the steps, tears slipping as she smiled. David leaned on the railing beside her, sleeves rolled. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Sounds like a miracle," he said softly. Sophie collapsed in the grass, arms spread, chest heaving with joy. Kaiser padded over, lowering his head to her ribs. She curled into him, fingers tangling in his fur. "You remembered me," she whispered, "and I'll never forget you." Kaiser blinked, tail brushing the grass. The bond was written in silence. David's throat ached as he watched. The rain-soaked bus stop replaying in his mind, the small hand reaching for Kaiser's paw. Sophie had survived because she had been heard, not in courtrooms, but in the quiet understanding of a dog who never turned away. Melissa joined them on the grass, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Mama, can we stay forever?" Sophie asked. Melissa kissed her forehead. "As long as you need." "Forever, if that's what it feels like." David stayed back, knowing his place. Not family by blood, but by choice. That was enough. As twilight spread lavender and gold, Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Will you stay for dinner?" He glanced at Melissa, who nodded. He smiled. "I'd be honored." Kaiser barked once, sealing the promise. That night, as Sophie whispered thanks before eating, David realized the truth he'd been running from. This wasn't just their new life. It was his too. The church bells tolled faintly, as Sophie laughed one last time before nightfall. Melissa leaned against David, whispering, "She's going to be okay." David nodded, eyes on Sophie curled into Kaiser's side. "Yeah, she already is." In a world full of storms, it had been a whisper in the rain that began the change, and in the amber eyes of a dog, healing had found its way home. Sometimes the simplest things remind us of the greatest truths, that love is often silent, loyalty doesn't need words, and the bond between a child and a German shepherd can be stronger than fear itself. Stories like Sophie and Kaiser's touch us, because they show what so many of us already know in our hearts. Animals aren't just pets. They are family, guardians, and sometimes even healers. If this story stirred something in you, maybe it's a nudge to spend a little more time with your own dog, listening, watching, appreciating the quiet ways they care for you. There's a resource I've been looking at lately that helps people deepen that connection. And if you're curious, you might enjoy it too. I'll leave the link below. No pressure, just something worth exploring if your heart leads you there. At the end of the day, what matters most is cherishing the loyal companion already by your side. Give them an extra scratch behind the ears tonight. They deserve it, and so do you.